Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think we're going to get started. My name is Warren Klein, and I'm the curator of the Bernard Museum here at Temple Emmanu-El, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to night one of our 4 Nights in the Museum program that has to do with our All About Golda exhibition. So before I introduce our guest tonight, I wanted to tell you a little bit about our other upcoming programs that have to do with Golda Meir. Some of you might have noticed this brochure out in the lobby. If not, you can get it on your way out. It has a full listing of everything from Golda's Balcony on December 11th to our retrospective on December 8th, which will feature everyone from Eleanor Burkett, who is a biographer of Golda Meir, to Haggai Soref, the archivist from the State Archives of Israel, Meron Mendizi, who actually worked with Golda Meir in the press office, and her other grandson, Shaul Rahabi. So those will be available, Eleanor Burkett's book, as well as this wonderful action figure we have, which is part of our Go Golda Go sweepstakes, will be available for sale in the lobby. And after our program tonight, we'll conclude in ample time to go up to the museum and enjoy some light refreshments and to view the exhibition if you haven't already. So it's my honor to introduce Gideon Meir, youngest of Golda's grandchildren. He was 16 when Golda died. Giddy was very close to his doting grandmother and witnessed her history-making firsthand as a child and as a teenager. A harpsichord and organ concert artist based in Tel Aviv, he is a graduate of San Francisco Conservatory, where he also served as assistant, and Oberlin Conservatory, where he received the Dean's Talent Award. Recently, Gideon founded a Baroque music ensemble in Paris. So without further ado, Gideon Meir.
Good evening. Good evening. Erev Tov. Tell me if you can hear me without the microphone. No. Okay. I knew it. It's like, okay. It's on. It's on. Good evening. It's a wonderful pleasure to be here with you. And thank you so much for coming and visiting with me and my memories. Today I'll present a combination. Hi, Alice. There are relatives here. There are friends I haven't seen in many years. There are relatives that I've only discovered today. Long-lost relatives of generations ago. I want to thank the Skirball Center for having me and Temple Emmanu-El, and I feel very much at home here, so I hope we're going to have fun. I'm not going to tell all about Golda's life because it's too rich. She lived for 80 years. She was in public offices for 50 years. She started her public work at the age of 8 and lived several lifespans, very rich. And so I'll touch upon a few periods in her life, a few events. I may forget some events. I may forget some things of importance. I will drop some names, and I won't humble myself. As I told the congregation on Friday, Golda Meir's story is a story for all, not just for girls who want to break glass ceilings, not just for Jews, not just for Zionists, and has not only to do with Israel. Learning from her life, we can all, I think, be inspired. So everybody knows she had humble beginnings, and what I can say is, from the stories that I heard as a child, in preparation for today, I've tried to put together what I remember from actual events that I witnessed, what I heard from her, from things of the past, and what I understand of them nowadays when I look at them. And I learn a lot about her because she never complained. When she told us how difficult things were, I didn't understand as a child how difficult they actually were. So in Tsarist Russia, as Jews, the one constant thing was that life was uncertain. The uncertainty of life. You didn't know where the next meal would come from. You didn't know if, where and when you would encounter violence and if you would survive it. And it was a very terrible thing. Now, Golda often said, when she was asked if she's a pessimist or an optimist, she said that she's an optimist and always had been. And her famous quote, that Jews can't afford to be pessimists. And I also read her sister Shana's autobiography. Shana was older and had a phenomenal memory and an acute sense of storytelling. So she really gives the details. And I was trying to think, where does this optimism come from? Because there's no inherent reason for optimism. So first of all, it's not a jolly optimism, oh, we're so happy, everything is wonderful, tomorrow is going to be full of light and laughter. It's an optimism that comes from no other choice. Because if you're not optimistic when life is so hard, there's just no way of going on. Another thing that I learned from these reminiscences of long ago, and which I find interesting and maybe can answer some of the questions we all have of what made Goldie great, what made her feel equal to all, to others. She didn't have a gender issue. She never did. And she came from a family of girls. There were 3 girls, and her mother came from a family of 4 girls, and one of my third cousins is sitting here, whose great-great-grandmother was my great-grandmother's sister. So I guess when you have a family at that time of only girls, they don't know what gender inequality is because it's not that the male siblings are singled out. They emigrated to America. It was, I hope someday that we translate Shana's book to English to make it available to all. I think there's a need for it because she goes into great details. They didn't have the right certificates. They had to bribe people on the way. Now, one thing I can tell you is that people were always nasty. There were always nasty people around. So if somebody was supposed to receive a bribe and take them to walk them across the border, they stole the money and left them in front of the border and things like that. So their way from the Ukraine, from Pinsk to Antwerp, the way was to go to Antwerp and get on a boat in Antwerp, and then they sailed to Canada, and from Canada to Milwaukee, because Golda's father was already in Milwaukee. They lost their belongings. They had to steal the border by night. They couldn't, Shana writes that they weren't able to eat the food on the ship because it was inedible. And Blume, her mother, managed to get some potatoes and onions and cooked them. They called it fish potatoes. There was no fish in this bouillabaisse, but it was just potatoes cooked with water and onion. I mean, it's not haute cuisine, and that's what they ate. And what I try to gather from that story was that they didn't have any kosher food, and maybe that's why they presumably had no food on the boat. They arrive in Milwaukee. Golda barely recognizes her dad. She's 8. She was 3 when he left. Zipke, Clara, the youngest, doesn't really remember him. Shane is full of remorse. She's angry that she's been taken away. Her beloved is still in Pinsk. She didn't manage to see him before they left because he was in hiding. They were revolutionaries. So Golda comes to Milwaukee and falls in love with the new world, the skyscrapers, the clean streets, the new clothes, and this opens the doors to her. Now, about the music today. Golda loved music above everything else, so I think it's appropriate that we celebrate her life with music. I asked some good friends to write me some pieces that go exactly with the stories. The friends are Joseph Haydn, Wolfie Mozart, Johannes Brahms, the guy with the Jewish soul, and Felix Mendelssohn. And with Felix Mendelssohn, I feel an affinity because we're both grandchildren of great people. Felix Mendelssohn was the grandson of Moses Mendelssohn, who's the founder of the Reform movement and the greatest Jewish philosopher of the 18th century. I'll start with some Mendelssohn. Milwaukee in the spring. Goldie's 8. She learns a little bit of English. They live in the Jewish neighborhood, so mostly Yiddish is spoken. When school starts, Shane takes Golda and Zipke to see the schoolmistress or principal. The school is bilingual because Milwaukee is a German town. The principal meets them, and she takes a liking to them immediately. She asks them for their names, so Shane presents herself, so she says, okay, you can be Jenny. And Golde, oh, we'll call you Goldie. And Chipke, because they were Litvaks, so they pronounced it Chipke. So she says, well, we'll have to call you Clara then. And Golda loves school from the first day. Shane, when she was in Russia, had to fight for the right to go to school, as I told in the sanctuary on Friday, and managed to go in Russia to a poor children's school that was run by the Sister of Sholem Aleichem, and the ticket was being poor enough to go to school because they couldn't pay. If you could pay, you weren't allowed in that school. And Sholem Aleichem, the greatest Jewish writer of the late 19th and early 20th century, came and read his stories to them himself. So this was an opener, an eye-opener, where if you fight to go to school, Sholem Aleichem might be there for you. So Golda can't wait to go to school. She loves school. Her mother has a grocery store, and she wants Goldie to tend the grocery store till she comes back from the market. And Goldie is late to school many times. She hates the store. It makes her cry. But luckily, one day a policeman in Milwaukee comes to talk to Mrs. Mabovich and say that it's against the law to keep her away from school. Golda makes up her mind to become a school teacher. So at the age of 14 or 15, she dreams of continuing to teacher's college. By the way, this girl of 8 that didn't know a word of English, by the time she finished school, was the valedictorian and gave the speech. And at some point, Clara Zipke told me that the librarian at the city library said, "We're sorry, Goldie, you read everything we had in the library." So when Myron Manzini tells you next month that he never saw Golda read a book, it was just not there. She always had stacks of books. Her parents don't want her to become a teacher because they're afraid she might not be able to marry, as was accustomed in those days. So she decides to run away from home to continue high school. She runs away to Shane's. There she meets my grandfather, Morris, and I will tell later more about Morris. And she meets more Zionists, and eventually they decide to make Aliyah, to become pioneers. And I'm making the story short because there's so much to tell. So eventually she made up with the parents. She went back to Milwaukee. She finished high school in Milwaukee. In the library, you'll see, in the exhibit here, you will see the yearbook of the Teachers College with her photo. Before setting off to Milwaukee, she was already married. In 1919, Goldie and Morris marry. Morris has to agree to go to Palestine. He wasn't originally a Zionist, but an internationalist. Shane and Shammai, with their daughter Judy, who's Alice's mother, were living at the time in Chicago. They go to part with them, and Shane is so excited that they're going to Palestine, she decides on the spot that she's going too. So they're a group of about 20 or so Americans that decide to go together. It's the first group going to Palestine from the States like that. Before, there were the fighters from the Jewish, they weren't called the Brigade, I can't remember right now what they were called, but the Jewish Legion that were fighting in the First World War and then settled in Palestine. Death, fire, flood, Mark Leiner's trip. This is from the New York Times. This made the New York Times. They sail in the Pocahontas. The Pocahontas is the former Prinzessin Irene. That was a German ship, and it was captured in the First World War, and then it was decommissioned, and it became a mail ship. And it was going from New York to Naples. It should have taken 14 days. They leave on May 22nd, and they arrive in Tel Aviv on July 14th. The engineers, we left New York, and this is from the New York Times. We left New York on May 22nd, said the master-at-arms for Naples, with 270 cabin passengers and 370 in the steerage. We had a scratch crowd of engineers picked up during the strike in New York, and trouble started in the engine room one day out. And it took the ship 9 days to reach Boston. All the engineers except the chief were fired in Boston, and after 8 days for repairs, we started out again. The pumps and bolters started to break down, and the condensers and refrigerators followed suit. And the spoiled food was dumped overboard, leaving only bully beef and brackish water for the passengers. The engineers in New York had pumped the fresh water into number 6 hold instead of into the tanks, and there was 7 feet of water down below when we took the hatches off in Naples. A fire was discovered in bunkers number 3 and number 4, which had to be flooded to extinguish the flames, and the water poured down into the hold. When the captain put into Punta del Gardo, that's in the Azores, for repairs, 4 of the engineers were heard saying on shore that they intended to sink the Pocahontas between the island and Naples. Captain Patterson clapped them all in irons until the ship reached Naples. There was some stabbing affrays between the Americans and the Spaniards in the engine room, but no one was killed. While we were in Naples, Arthur Pendergast, driven crazy by engine room troubles, jumped overboard and was drowned. Some Italian stewards stole the silverware because they could not get their wages from the agents of the United States Mail Company who had chartered the Pocahontas from the United States Shipping Board. One of them was caught with a suitcase filled with silverware, and when told that he would be fired $25, died from a heart attack. So this was the fun cruise on the Pocahontas. When I heard about this as a child, they always told this story as now we laugh, but it was no laughing matter. It was kind of scary. Then they took the train to Brindisi, and from there they took a boat to Alexandria to get on a train and go through the Sinai to Tel Aviv. In Brindisi, Shana writes, they meet a group of Lithuanian pioneers that tried 3 times to land in Tel Aviv, but at the time, it was 1921. At first, the borders were closed by the British because there was unrest with the Arabs. Then, when the borders were open, the Arab porters in Jaffa were on strike and didn't let the pioneers off. So these Lithuanians traveled back and forth from Italy to Jaffa. When Golda meets them, she's enamored with these pioneers. They're real pioneers from the old country. They've had harsh lives, not like us Americans. And she tries to befriend them. At first, they're snobbish and they don't want to befriend these Americans. And when Golda finds out that they can only afford, that they're traveling on the board, she decides that the Americans will travel with them. When she finds out that they ran out of supplies and don't have food for the way, she decides that they'll share the food together. They arrive in Alexandria, and Golda doesn't write about it much, about Alexandria. But Shana, who worked at a sanatorium in Denver before, and everything had to be spick and span, writes how shocking it was, just the filth, and it was hot. It was July, and there were these Edwardian girls with long skirts and long hair that they couldn't wash on the boat, and it was real agony. They get on the train, and there's no water for a 12-hour ride in July. They arrive in Tel Aviv. At the station, nowadays it's a beautiful tourist trap in Tel Aviv. Then it was one tiny building. There was one tree that cast shade, and that was it. It was all sands. The pair of Americans that they thought would meet them there, their friends from the States, they found out that that same day they were in Jerusalem getting new travel papers because they had it and they were going back. They stepped down in the heat, and Golda always suffered from sun and heat, and nobody meets them. There's no shade. And one of the friends they traveled with, who was quite a wit, Yossel Kopilov, says, "No, Golda, now we've come, you've seen it, there's nothing here, let's go back." A hotel manager comes and gets them. They walk on foot from, some of you know Tel Aviv, from the train station on the edge of Jaffa near the sea to Montefiore Street, waiting in the sand with whatever was left of their belongings, because again, on these trips you always lose your belongings. And they come to the hotel, and they want to make sure that there are no bed bugs. The hotel manager says, if there's a bed bug, I'll give you £1 for each bed bug. And Yossel says, okay, we're going to hit it rich. Haydn had the And I hope there are no Jews here because I'm going to say something nasty. People are not very nice in Tel Aviv at that time. And I think some of them are snobs towards the newcomers, and some of them, I think, are reacting to the hardships. And a lot of people there are very, very bitter. They look for an apartment, a room or two. Everybody wants a year's rent in advance because they figure that people may leave in the middle of the year, so they might make a good buck from that. And they want 30 English pounds. It's a lot of money. So they look, and finally they find someone who's willing to take 6 months' rent at 15 pounds rent. So, and I don't think this person was altruistic. I think they just found somebody who, auf Zerleuches, was honest. They live 7 grown-ups and 2 children in 2 rooms. There's a toilet in the yard, which is common to all the apartments around that yard. They did have their own tiny kitchen. Since they lost their belongings, somebody lends them a couple of sheets, and it's a great luxury. I'm sure they traded who would use the sheets, and they couldn't all use the two sheets all at once, I should hope, but these were the 20s, you know, anything could have happened then. And the sheets are stolen, or as they say here in New York, they're stole from the clothesline. And Yossel airs his 1 pair of trousers of his suit on the clothesline, and that's stolen too. And with his great sense of humor, he publishes and he puts an ad in the paper, and he says, would the person who stole my trousers please come forward and give them back, or at least come and take the jacket as well. So their secret weapon was their sense of humor, but the sense of humor shows that life was really unbearable. Goldie and Morris want to go to a kibbutz, and that was Golda's dream, and that was the one thing she always talked about later in life, that she regretted not staying in the kibbutz. And they decide to go to Merchavia, because Merchavia, now it's not like today that there are many kibbutzim. There weren't that many kibbutzim. You had to wait till the beginning of the year to be perhaps accepted. In Merchavia, there were Americans that came over in World War I, mostly men. There were 8 girls, all the rest were men. They weren't too keen about a married couple. They didn't have much use for a married couple. Golda said that they thought that Americans wouldn't work, but hey, they were Americans too, so I don't know exactly what the story was. They did have a gramophone, my grandparents, with a beautiful collection of records, which included Dame Nellie Melba, cantorial singing by Lewandowski and the great cantors of the time. They had Caruso, they loved Caruso, they heard Caruso sing in New York. They had, that's the kind of records, and they believed they were accepted for the gramophone. Food was very bad in Merchavia. Part of it is the poverty. Part of it was that they didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to cook eggplant. They didn't know how to cook squash. They had hummus, chickpeas that they would buy from the Arabs, but they didn't know how to cook them. So it was terrible. The oil, the olive oil that was sold to them by the Arabs, they probably got last year's or really old oil that was terrible. It was packaged in goat skin. This, for Golda, was incredibly gross. And she tried to make things better in the Merchavia kitchen. And she said that the quality of the food is that the cultural the quality of the culture has to do with the quality of the food. That if the food is bad, the conversation is all about the food. And if the food is good, nobody mentions the food and they talk about other things. When the food was really bad, mostly the guys, they would put all the plates in a row and send them off. They called it the food train, send it back to the kitchen. Another story that she told was of the cookies that they would bake on Friday for Saturday morning. And the girls in turn working in the kitchen would bake the cookies, and then they would hide the cookies because I guess they were kind of crackers. They would hide them because the guys would look for them and eat them up on Friday. And this was a whole mishigas going on. So when it was her turn, she figured that if she puts them in the kitchen cupboard, nobody's gonna look. And so that's how the cookies were saved. And then she realized that the cookies, they didn't have butter. They didn't even have sugar for the cookies. So if it's just flour, which was unsifted and things would come out purple, she said, if it was just this unsifted flour and water, she might as well make 2 batches of cookies and have one for Friday night and one for Saturday morning. So that shows you a little bit more about Golda's wits. And another thing about Merchavia that she didn't write, but she told us, was she was told early on not to wear white clothes at night because of snipers. And she did ride, they had one horse, and sometimes she rode the horse. She could ride a horse. In Merchavia, people would get, the work was very hard, and people would get sick. So you either had tuberculosis, or you had malaria, or you had both. And poor Goldie didn't have it. And she felt would be very embarrassed not to have malaria. Eventually, she did have malaria, but not the dramatic kind with a high fever, but the walking malaria, where you keep on working and you have a low temperature till you're almost finished. And she tells that one of the guys rode to a fula and managed to get some ice and a lemon, which was a great, great luxury, and make her lemonade when she had malaria, and that was the best refreshment she ever had. She remembered it always. What I remember from my teenage years was malaria comes back sometimes. And in the 70s, she had a bout of malaria again. And I mean, nowadays it's no big deal because there's more medicine, but it's not very nice to get malaria. Haydn in the One of the times when she goes by Merchavia again, many years later, it's 1948, 2 or 3 days before the Declaration of Independence. She's on her way with Ezra Danin. Ezra Danin was of the Arab department of the Palmach. They're on their way to Amman, Jordan, to see King Abdallah. She asks King Abdallah for the appointment. This was not the first time they met. Golda was in the capacity of the head of the political department of the Sukhnut. This was like the autonomous government, Jewish government of the time. And this was a very important position. And in previous talks, King Abdallah said that he would stay out of the fighting. The war of independence actually started on the 30th of November 47, after the declaration at the UN. But there was reason to think that once independence is proclaimed, once the British were about to leave on the 14th of May in 1948, and the Arab armies were ready to invade once the British left. King Abdallah was believed in coexistence with the Jews. He wasn't for an independent Jewish state, but he thought that it was actually good that Jews from the West were settling in the Middle East. He looked forward to it. And at first he made a promise back in November that he would stay out of the fighting, and she wanted to make sure that he would stick to his word. And what she tells is, on the way, she and Ezra Danin discuss that there's going to be a war, and it's going to be a bloody war, but if he stays out of it, it won't be as bad as it can be. So this is a very important mission. As a child, I loved the story. I would ask her again and again to tell the story when you visited King Abdallah. It had everything in it. It had the exoticism of going to Jordan. It had meeting a friend who's a king, a real king. There was disguise. She had to disguise herself as an Arab woman with a long black dress that was made for her by a seamstress in Haifa. This was very top secret, so all the preparations were very secret, and she had a veil. And Ezra dressed as an Arab man, and he spoke fluent Arabic, and it was kind of safe that as long as she had the veil and people couldn't see that she was European and fair, she wouldn't be talked to as a Muslim woman. I mean, nobody would assault her by talking to her. They cross the border at Naharaim, and they're met by an emissary of the king. They have to change cars along the way so that they're not followed. And it's dark. They arrive in Amman. I forgot to say that I always wanted to hear the story, but she didn't like telling the story. And nowadays I understand why, because it was such a painful, painful story. They arrive in Amman, and the king says that now he's part of the Arab League. He can't withdraw from fighting, and they have to leave. I mean, they leave without anything. They're driven back. The driver is so afraid that he lets them off a few kilometers from the border, and they have to walk in perfect silence at night, making sure that they're going the right way. And she with a veil on and with a long dress. And when the Haganah member finally sees them, she grabs his hand, and she says that she never clutched someone's hand so strongly. This was a terrible, terrible mission, because they really tried their best, but it was such a terrible frustration that they knew that war will happen. Ezra Danin also told the king, he warned him, he said, when you go to the mosques, you let the people kiss the hems of your garment. You have to be very careful. And about 2 years later, King Abdullah was assassinated because he did want ties with the Jews. Sadat paid with his life too, and Rabin also paid with his life. It was his memorial Saturday, so I want to mention that. I have a night piece for the Night Journey to Amman by Mozart. She arrives in Tel Aviv and goes to report to Ben Gurion, and she cries. 2 days later, the Declaration of Independence. She's supposed to go to Jerusalem, to fly in a two-seater to Jerusalem, because she's in charge of besieged Jerusalem. And things were very difficult. There was no water, and there were no supplies. It must have been a very tough job. It's one of the chapters in her history that hasn't been researched much, and it probably should be. I'm sure that part of the success that Jerusalem survived had to do with her being at that position. It was a very windy day, and luckily the plane couldn't make it to Jerusalem and lands back in Tel Aviv, and that's how she's at the ceremony. She was supposed to sign in any case. She would have signed later, but she goes to the ceremony. She puts on her best dress. She washes her hair before. She writes about it. She goes to the ceremony, and then she sees the different people. She thinks of those who haven't made it to the ceremony. Some of her cronies died young, and she cries as she signs, and she's asked, why are you crying? And she says later, as a schoolgirl in America, she read about people signing declarations of independence, but she never thought that she'd be one of those. Later, 25 years later, there is another terrible war that cannot be avoided, the Yom Kippur War. For months, she was worried. For months, the army intelligence said nothing's going to happen. And there was a fiasco, an intelligence fiasco. But the war couldn't be avoided. She tried, since Sadat came to power, I don't remember if it was in 1970 or 71, she tried through Kissinger, she tried through Willy Brandt, she tried even through Ceausescu. She even went to Romania because Ceausescu, I think he was trying to get bribes, but because he didn't really do anything, when she was in Romania, apparently the PLO even tried to get her coming out of the synagogue. And there's no official documentation of it. But years after the peace with Egypt and after President Sadat was assassinated, his wife Jehan Sadat said that he was not willing to do any kind of negotiation before the war. When Sadat came to Jerusalem, Golda was in the States. She was here in New York for UJA and Israel bonds, and she heard that he was coming, and she got on the plane and came back at once. We were very excited about all of this. I remember her the night before he arrived. She said, "What am I going to tell him? What am I going to say when I meet him?" When they met, they kissed, and she said, "Mr. President, what took you so long?" When I watched today, when I watched the footage of their congenial meeting at the Knesset and the body language, and it's obvious to me that they've probably met before. I'm sure they didn't meet before the war, but perhaps after the agreement of the Kilometer 101, the arms withdrawal. I think she met perhaps through the Shah of Iran. She used to go and see the Shah of Iran. It was top secret back then. Nowadays, everybody knows about it. And I have to find who to ask. You see, Golda was very good about keeping secrets. We knew at home that we cannot repeat what we hear, and some secrets we knew about. But the really top secrets, she knew how to keep. And I'm just guessing. Brahms, Intermezzo. Now I would like to speak a little about my grandfather, Morris Meyerson. I didn't know Morris. He passed away in 1951. He died in Golda's apartment while visiting family friends that were staying there. I've been asked recently by a historian who researches women and women in Israel and the pioneers, and she's writing a book about women leaders in the 50s. And she asked me this question: what sets Golda apart? What made Golda unique? And I shared this question with my brother Danny, and he laughed, and he says, what made Golda unique? The fact that she was Golda. But I searched a little in my head, and I thought, Beba Edelson was married to Bar Yehuda. He was also a leader. Manya Shochat was married to Israel Shochat, who was also a leader. Rachel Yanait Ben Tzvi was married to Ben Tzvi, who was also a leader. Golda was married to a man who wasn't a leader, who wasn't a public person, who supported her, who gave her his love, and let her do her own thing. And when things got hard because she had to do her own thing, and sometimes it was too difficult for him, they separated so that she could do her own thing. They stayed friends, they stayed very loving,